I guess my first question would be, how did God call you and Linda into ministry and then lead you from the South? I'm not talking about Southern New England, but Southern United States to New England.
Well, I guess we go back a ways, as I've said, approaching 94, but a native of Kentucky, and Linda also. I was born in Western Kentucky, grew up there, she in Northern Kentucky. I was part of a small rural church, had great pastors, was converted at a very young age, and then the Lord allowed me to go off to college. I went to the University of Kentucky for a while, studying to be a civil engineer. The Lord sort of changed my direction there. I happened to become a part of an organization on campus at University of Kentucky called BSU. Now, that's the old name. I'm sure today's students would sort of say, "What's that?" Baptist Student Union, Baptist Campus Ministry is how it's evolved into today. But went to BSU and found a dimension to the Christian life that maybe my rural church had not failed, but just wasn't equipped to give it to me. So I went to the Baptist Student Union Convention that fall, not far from my home in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, First Baptist Church, and there uh, surrendered to the invitation to come and become a pastor, a preacher, a minister. And so came back to UK and surrendered my engineering scholarship and went to a Baptist college, Campbellsville College. Finished there and went on to Georgetown. Made my way on to Southern Seminary and pastored a small church in northern Kentucky. In northern Kentucky, just really a part of greater Cincinnati there. And while I was pastoring there, I met my wife, Linda Doherty, and we were married. And the Lord gave us a son, Kevin, and we served the church there. And I guess the Lord was sort of using the word missions to us, bringing it to mind. And so then the optimum calling would have been what we called foreign missions. And so we filled out some application forms, did some of the early work, and I had some minor health issues. And so those days, the Foreign Mission Board was very, very strict. And so we were told that probably you would not qualify for mission service overseas. And so we accepted that, and our church then shifted churches. I moved into a new church plant, and so my days in church planting really began in Kentucky. A new church plant south of Cincinnati in northern Kentucky, and we had to put. And again, the old days was called a World Missions Conference. It's gone morphed into several titles through the years, but you had 5 days, maybe 4 or 5 days, where missionaries came, overseas missionaries, home missionaries, state missionaries. And one of those nights, we had a speaker from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and he told about the exciting venture of Kentucky, of Southern Baptist north of the Mason-Dixon, of what was going on in Wisconsin, new church plants, and how exciting it was. Well, we thought, let's explore that. So we went off to Ridgecrest that summer and Home Missions Conference Week and thought, well, this week we'll probably get directions from the Lord, maybe to go across the river into nearby Cincinnati or Cleveland or Detroit, so no, not far from Linda's parents and my parents, both parents in Kentucky. And that's where we would go into new work for Southern Baptists. But as the Lord would have his way, he placed us next door in the dining hall to Owen Sherrill, who was a pioneer church planter in New England, in Massachusetts. At the time, there were just 13 small churches and missions for the 13 million people, as far as Southern Baptists were concerned. And Owen said, Merwyn and Linda, if you'd like to be in on the ground floor of Southern Baptist expansion north, why don't you consider coming to New England? That somehow struck a chord, and New England just took uh, launching there and never went away from us. We went back home and filled out applications for being a church planter. Church starter was the old term,
Hmm.
and got a call. This would have been in late 1963 from Elmer Sizemore, who was the area missionary all the way from Caribou, Maine down to New Jersey, covering 7 or 8 states there. He wore out many sets of tires there. Said we have a small church there in Northborough, Massachusetts, just west of Boston, 32 miles, maybe 25 people or so, and they need a pastor. Would you consider coming? And the normal answer would have been, well, I'll pray. We'll pray about it, but I just sort of blurted out, yes, when. The Lord had said New England is on your radar already. So we soon had a call from the pastor search committee of the tiny church, Rice Memorial Baptist Church. Would you come up and let us get acquainted and see if the Lord will be leading you and us to have ministry together? So flew up onto the old uh, piston constellation, the Conti as they called it, had never been in a large plane, and flew into Boston. And even back then, Logan was a nightmare. But folks from the church met us and we preached that weekend, went back home, and sure enough, the call came to come to be pastor. So Linda and our 1-year-old son, we loaded up our little Rambler and rented the U-Haul and headed to Northborough and became the pastor. The irony was the Rice Memorial Baptist Church was meeting, Robbie, in the second floor above the local Grange Hall, steep steps going up, 25 to 30 people. And again, just down the street was the white church steeple building that had formerly been the Baptist church of the community, but now was the local historical society. So I guess that was one of our first introductions to New England. The religious scene was that what had once been so vibrant and so pioneering, uh, things had changed through the years. And we learned also that Rice had historical concepts. Luther Rice, pioneer Baptist missionary, born right there in Northborough. And that also, other firsts in New England, we found that the Haystack Prayer Meeting out in Williamstown, Rice and Judson and Samuel, uh, somebody was there, and they felt the call to go to missions, to dedicate themselves to going abroad. At that time, American believers had no missionaries overseas. And so out of that came Rice and Judson going to Burma. On the way over, they studied the Greek New Testament and felt that they could be more in line with the Baptist interpretation and became Baptists. But this time, Baptists had no support network at all. So Rice came back and up and down the eastern seaboard preaching missions to the fledgling uh, Baptist groups. And so that sort of got us into New England. Uh, We'll cover the transition to Vermont a little bit later, but does this ring a bell with
Yeah.
you, right? Uh,
So, so tell me what, in terms of the culture in Northborough, a suburb of Boston, were there surprises for you and Linda? Your 1-year-old son wasn't aware of anything at this point, but what kind of surprises, maybe just about life in New England, about the culture of New England, um, and the churches in New England, but just that culture and all that that you guys stepped into.
needless to say, very different from our uh, mostly rural Kentucky backgrounds. Accents were certainly different. They enjoyed listening to us, and we enjoyed listening to them. I guess our son was the first one to pick up on a New England accent. In 2 or 3 years, he went off to a day school, nursery school, and he came home singing a little ditty. Pigs in the parlor, skip to Maloo. Pigs in the parlor, skip to Maloo. And we said, Kevin, what's a parlor? And of course, our old Kentucky word was parlor, pigs in the parlor. So he embraced the new accent, I guess, more than we did. But I guess how of course, the climate was very different.
Hmm.
Kentucky would see maybe a few inches of snow, and Linda liked snow up until maybe March, but after that, she was glad for it to take a hike. I liked it year round almost. And,
Dang.
there was one year in New England, what, 1800 and something, and froze to death, that it snowed every month, I think, in Vermont. So the culture was different. We were just struck by the fact that where so many of our early, even Baptist beginnings, through the years, things had changed. Um, even up in Kittery, Maine, the pastor there took his whole congregation and sailed south to Charleston, South Carolina, William Screven. And so uh, the climate there was just not very conducive to some of the tenets that the Baptists were holding. And so he formed the first Baptist church in the South. And so again, Luther Rice, and I guess we were one of the excitements of being in Northborough was the fact that the church had bought a small parcel of land right on Route 20, and we discovered that the Rice home site, not the actual building, but the home site and several acres had come onto the market. I had told the realtor when we first moved there and I learned about Luther Rice, let us know if this ever becomes on the market. And he told us. And so with the help of the Home Mission Board, now the North American Mission Board, we were able to purchase that property. And the home that today is on the site of the original Rice home is very useful in ministry and convention headquarters there for you're in and out, Robbie. So we found that New England had so much to offer, and our hearts all the time were growing in sense of uh, understanding and commitment, and that people were so warm to us and inviting. I guess the stereotype that sometimes even folks in New England said that we're a little bit standoffish and not quite as warm as folks in the South, but we will accept you. And they certainly did. They took us right in. And having a 1-year-old son opened many doors
Yeah,
for families there.
absolutely.
You know that, but the children often God uses them.
So obviously, you all adapted, integrated into the culture, and you stuck around. The family stuck around for quite a while. What would what encouragement would you give to pastors and their family as they're thinking about possibly making that move, or they've made the move and it's still pretty new? Maybe they haven't experienced winter yet, or maybe they haven't experienced, one thing or another. But what encouragement would you give to, I mean, we talk about the foreign mission field, international, but you're crossing several cultural barriers in moving your family up from northern Kentucky. So what encouragement would you give to young families and or middle-aged or retired that have come up to do ministry and serve here?
Well, I guess the foundation would be the call.
Hmm.
As I told you, we had the clear-cut call that it was New England. I guess we could say New England or bust. Not that if God had said otherwise, but I just fell in love with New England, with its culture, with its rich history, secular history. So much of the beginning of our nation occurred right there in Boston and the other New England states. So I would say, if you're considering coming to a place like New England or another area that's so different from where you are, just consider if God calls, then He provides.
Mhm.
I've never felt that that was not a stark truth there. God will provide, and so I suppose just to personalize it, we spent about 6.5 years at Rice, and the new building was just under construction. We were out of that Grange Hall, with that long flight of rickety steps. Could really settle in, but at this point, being from rural backgrounds, we took trips into Vermont and New Hampshire, especially this time of year, and we're just caught up into the rural beauty, the farms, of course, the foliage, the dairy barns, just all that spoke to us a good bit of our heritage. Except across Vermont, not every hamlet would have, say, a Baptist church. And there were Baptist churches there, or buildings at least, over in Bennington, not far from Bennington. I noticed one day in driving that on the church sign it said local library. The church had ceased to exist there.
Mhm.
And we learned that in our town of Randolph, a former church had now become a private home. And so this was sort of um, disturbing for us and we'd heard stories of the Great Awakening back even in Vermont and rural Vermont. When it was over, at one point, 50 Baptist churches had been born out of that great visit of God's Holy Spirit. And yet today, probably on one hand or less, you could find those churches. So we were enamored with the beauty, but we were just burdened by perhaps the need for more evangelical witnesses throughout the state. So I would say, again, people considering leaving the South to come north or in the North to make changes, the call is absolutely basic, foundational, because at times when there are discouragements and things are not going so well. And part of that excitement, the beauty, the history, sort of is dimmed a bit, and you're with the day-to-day grind. Uh, about what's all you have left is that, well, God called me here, called us here, and see, and God doesn't make mistakes. So I guess that sort of sums it up, Robbie.
And you not only were adapting and integrating, but you were and shepherding a church, but you were shepherding your family.
Yes.
And that could be a very difficult transition for a family. Any little nuggets there in terms of pastor shepherding his family up here in New England?
I think the blessing that we shared was the fact that our family was very young. Uh, Moving, say, from the South to New England with teenagers, a different story, or even just younger than that. And Kevin was joined after a while in Massachusetts with a sister, Paula, and she was born in Memorial Hospital in Worcester. And so we like to say that Paula was our little Yankee. She didn't have to move to New England. Uh, Her roots were there from the very beginning. So I would say, again, just make sure your family's tight knit and that as not in addition to ministry, but alongside of ministry, sometimes just family activities, the family doing things that they would enjoy together and using the family, as I said, often children open the door for ministry,
Everything.
actually.
Mhm. Okay, I probably should make this known to those listening, those who will be listening. You're very much you have a historical perspective and an obvious love of history. I've always said that if God didn't call me into full-time pastoring uh, eh, mission work, that I would either want to be a literary professor, a literature professor, or a history professor. So whenever I get around somebody, and you know a bit of history about New England, but you wrote a book that covered the first 40 years, 1958 to 1998, of God's work among the Baptists in New England. What prompted you to write that book, that very important book?
I suppose the fact that what was happening from the very beginning in New England, those first 13 churches until 1958, I can't recall just the number, but we were 150 maybe or 175. We'd grown in that 40-year period. That we were foundation building,
Hmm.
laying the foundation, ministering then day to day, presently, but looking ahead toward the future. And what happens to most foundations? At some point, they get covered over, and the superstructure says, look how tall and stately I am. And the poor foundation is several feet below. And I thought that the churches at that time, mostly in New England, even in 1958, there were maybe a dozen to 20 churches that had grown stronger, nice buildings and facilities, and even planting missions. But still, the work was in its early stages. And so most churches would not have the energy or time or uh, people or talent for someone to write the history of the churches, to put all these dates down. I want it to be known that Roscoe and Daisy Anderson left Florida or Alabama back in the early 60s and traveled to Burlington area through their work. He worked out at the power uh, station out there and did not find the warmth and evangelical spirit of churches they had known back in Florida. So I felt, and they pioneered in planting that church long before a pastor came and it helped to develop. Susan Brindle came and moved it along. And today, New King is still very strong there. New name, but still the same Lord and the same ministry. So I wanted folks like the Andersons and these early pioneer folks, the Sizemores, and I could name a dozen people that it needs to be recorded how God used them.
I agree.
Today I know we have all sorts of uh, modern techniques, the webinar and technical aspects, and yet I think the print aspect, written history, it can still be useful, and for the present and for the future.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the reasons, so that our history, not that we want it to boast or brag, but it just needs to be there for posterity. I guess that's the word I've been fishing for.
Well, I discovered your book the year that we moved to Vermont from Washington, D.C. We had planted a church there. We had been there for 7 years. And we got the call. God affirmed it. That's what I want you and your young family to do. A 1-year-old daughter and my wife Kim and I. And I got a hold of your book, and I I, I had a sense that New England was special because I love history.
Mhm.
But as I began to read your book, it became more than just a special place. It became a place we had to be. And then, your time in Vermont just just whet my appetite and gave me encouragement, gave me a sense that yes, yes, we are in the right place and God has called us. He knows what he's doing. And there have been some pioneers ahead of us who have kind of marked a trail.
Well, I guess maybe in a distant way, I thought maybe somebody out there um, in the South would read that and be challenged to come and join the work in New England. And as you said, I just loved history. Uh, in the background, you can see some of the few books that I have, history. Still read. Um, there are so many ways today that we can get our information and news, but I still like to pick up something and hold it. So the secular history just was intriguing. The Pilgrims, all that happened in the Boston area, and on into New England, up into New Hampshire and Maine. And so that was part of the love of when it became possible that we could develop a history And I'm hoping that at some point that it's picked up and we go even further. But it was a labor of love, and it was labor at times. Those were the early days of thumb drives and stuff like that. That I even then I was already being left out in left field with technology. But look the difference today that we can have. And I guess I would have been thrilled back then to have had a chat box or to said, AI, come bail me out here. And some people said, one person said, maybe he wasn't too thrilled with the book. It wasn't as exciting as maybe he had anticipated. He said just a collection of names and dates and places and things like that. Well, that's what history is.
Yes.
And, you tried to make it exciting, and it is. It was, and so that's a little bit of, I guess, why I felt that God had laid His hand and directed me to be a part of the history there.
And I'm glad he did. And I pray, as you do, that God would put it on someone else's heart to continue that and record that. I want to switch gears just a little bit,
Uh-huh.
and the kind of the series that we're doing that has been so much fun for me, and a chance to get to know some of these people that were heroes in New England that God had used in tremendous ways to kind of pave a pathway. To the series, The Heart of a Pastor, and talking about a pastor's heart, integrity of heart, an upright heart, fully devoted to the Lord. And we read about David. How did you try to live that out? The integrity of heart, the upright heart, fully devoted to God as a as a son of God, as a husband, a dad, as a pastor, as a missionary, all those things. How did you try to live that out in those days?
Well, of course, it would have to start with the prayer, Lord, give me a pastor's heart. Sometimes you're so engrossed in the day-to-day grind, as we sometimes say, just the mechanics of living family and all the things that happen along the way that are we wouldn't classify them as too spiritual, but give me a pastor's heart. And as maybe you've opened the door for me to be instrumental in helping to plant a church, give me the kind of understanding and what would be needed and somebody to come and nurture and take this church on. Somebody who also loves history and who loves New England and has some sense of what God is doing here. Um, the pastor's heart is concerned for those that are directly you're involved with, close by, and yet look at the overall picture. Um, New England, I think today has around 15 million people. Back in 1964, when we came, there were 12 million, I think. So New England has grown, and much of that growth has occurred and is occurring today through ethnic groups, internationals who are there. Somebody said probably 3 million of the 15 million are ethnic. And it's been said, and maybe still true, that that's been some of the fastest growth among our total number of churches, the ethnic churches. And that even though language often might be something of a barrier, the pastor's heart says that it's a noble calling, and as I said, the calling is basic to it. We had we had a program called Church Planter Apprentices, a 2-year program. Pastor would come, and so a young pastor and his wife came to Vermont. I won't give any more details, but he left after about a year. And what had been instrumental there, he said he had counted the number of cloudy days
Hmm.
that there had been in Vermont, and just that did fit his sense of call, what it's all about. And so, and the pastor's heart has to rejoice when people uh, feel as you do and have that love for people and love for that starting and beginning and just a few people growing to more. And the pastor's heart is with them when you see something that had started, has such promise, and yet sometimes the Satan moves in, and we've had sometimes other theological leanings, beliefs that crept in and lured away a couple of our churches and pastors. That was always heartbreaking. That a pastor's heart was broken at that point. How we had poured so much into it, in terms of the early stages of planting, maybe the surveys, bringing uh, volunteers. And I don't know where to throw this in, but I would encourage pastors still across New England to never minimize the value of volunteers that come in all shapes, sizes, and forms. Youth groups, uh, construction workers, uh, pastors who have retired. The list is long. So I guess the pastor's heart was trying to transpose my thoughts into how they were feeling and to identify, to hurt with them, to cry with them. And yet there are times that we laugh together. Some situations were so ridiculous that you just had to laugh. So a pastor's heart maybe needs a little bit of laughter along the way too.
So glad.
One,
Uh,
go
you,
ahead.
you referred to, and I think any pastor anywhere kind of has experienced the grind.
Mm,
And I think missionaries, sometimes because they're crossing several barriers, that grind can maybe seem more intense and perhaps even be more intense. Are there any you mentioned prayer and as a
mm.
starting point, but other habits or practices that have sustained you not only in New England but continue to sustain you as a follower of Jesus?
Well, this is partly secular and sacred. When you've been very involved in some new effort to plant or to nurture, to grow the church, to revive, to bring back, and things are moving along, and you can take a little break.
Hmm.
And I called it the carrot stick. In front of me was the fact that down the way over in Bethel, they were having a used library book sale, a used book sale on a certain day. And so I marked that on the calendar. I'm a bookaholic, Linda says, and that's never changed. And I guess part of my pastor's heart that the pastors that would come to New England also would have a desire to, of course, first of all, God's word, steeped
Mhm.
in God's word, but then others who he is blessed to write about God's word, to study, and not just off the cuff come into the pulpit to say, well, this is a tiny little church, just a handful of people.
Hmm.
I don't have to give them, my best,
That's so
and
good.
so I think that was vital to cherish and to the small, the little. You hope that it grows, and you want it to grow, but God does the growing. We plant the seed and have a part of the nurturing and watering, but He really brings about the growth. And so sometimes the seed maybe have sprouted and it looked as if it were going to take off and blossom, and yet something happens and the seed fall by the wayside. And yet I think we mentioned earlier that sometimes that what maybe today seems to have failed, but God was working then, and people poured themselves into labor and said, "I believe that God is here." And then maybe sometimes 10, 20 years later, uh, that same place, seed are planted and nurtured again, and this time it blossoms. There are a
Yeah.
couple of places in Vermont right now that are thriving works. And I've spoken with the two pastors about how we tried years ago with church planter apprentices there. And we had works that started, looked as if they would grow and become mature. But something happened after the 2 years, those leaders left. Both of them went into overseas missions. That was great. God had called them, but somehow the work didn't have the depth that it needed, and they sort of appeared to die off as far as anything structured, nothing, organized. But then today, those two of those places, they're thriving works. And so God has his math sometimes is very different from ours, and how he brings about progress. It may skip a few years, but the seed have been planted. And that's the majesty and the glory of God. We can't put him in a box and say, you've got to act this way.
Absolutely. What about on the flip side of that?
Mhm.
What were some dangers or temptations that you needed to guard against in your own heart in terms of, having that heart of integrity? What that you faced?
Suppose one, again, such a love of history. I love secular history as well as spiritual and sacred history.
Mhm.
Not to go too far in that direction, that I would neglect uh, other attributes of my ministry, prayer and studying that which would cause me to be a better church planter, techniques and all of that. And I don't know if that was what you'd call a pitfall, but and the pitfall again, reverting back to family, a danger of uh, neglecting your family when you should be attending. I thought I was attending the family of God, which is important, but God's given you a wife and two children here also to nurture them. That neither of our children, our daughter or son, have ever said, Dad, you neglected us, or we wish you'd been home more. We wish you could have come to more of our concerts for Paula or our baseball games. Kevin, in fact, he just sat on the bench. He never got onto the field. But I
He
went to,
looked good on that bench, and you
that's
guys were
right.
there.
And so I guess maybe that would be it, a temptation to let um, sometimes the larger family out there uh, invade or intrude into your personal family that God had given me. So that would be one thing. And
What about did you and Linda ever struggle, or were you tempted to struggle with comparison and with other churches, other pastors, other places where God was doing things? Was that ever a factor for you? I would imagine as a director of missions that you would encounter planters and pastors that struggled with that.
yes, and who knows how some do grow uh, quicker and faster than others, and how do you deal with that? Uh, you avoid you don't compete. We never practice competition, and in some places, God wants a smaller effort, smaller work, not effort, but His vision there is not a mega church and a or some program that something might work in a city or suburban area in greater Boston. The techniques, the tools for that, you can't maybe transplant that into Cabot or Peacham, Vermont, and so trying to again going back to the code, God's placed you here, and if He wants you here, then He'll guide in the approaches and not be jealous. And I never encountered pastors who were jealous of other pastors. The pastors related well. They cried well at times, and at times, as we've said, laughed well. One of our churches began with two ladies meeting in the strawberry patch. And that's how the church in Manchester was born. Two ladies met picking strawberries there.
It sounds like
And
Philippi.
that's right. So that's not a good answer to that. And I've not maybe not thought a lot about that because I didn't observe people
Mhm.
who were necessarily feeling like that they were left behind or didn't get enough recognition. And we would, encourage them to go to meetings, to conferences, and sometimes there would be somebody there that had glowing reports, of how God was just
Hmm.
breaking out all over the place, and they maybe thought, well, hey, look at where I am. It's not even a trickle seems to be happening. But if they rely at that point, God has called me to this place. Just exciting. Last Sunday, Terry mentioned that he went to the 10th anniversary of the church over in Chelsea.
Hmm.
And I just so excited how that has grown from just a drop into a fountain that's flowing today. And that it's been so small at times, and that he and his wife have been so faithful there. So,
Much of Vermont and good part of northern New England has been experiencing quite a drought. And you'll see some of the brooks in our area, in Waterville area, and around Lamoille County. Many are dried up, but it just, like Elijah, he it took the
mhm.
drop, and but didn't lose heart, stuck with it, and we never know because God's timing is not our timing.
That's for sure. And we
Can I-
invest ourselves in people, not even buildings always. I know some of as a church planter, you see groups that were able to get a building, a structure,
Mhm.
facilities much quicker than somebody else. And yet, it's people that we've put our main focus on.
Wow.
And I often notice this, and maybe this was maybe not the happiest concepts, but some of our churches reached more people by the number in temporary facilities than they did once they got the nice, lovely building. Maybe a steeple, maybe not a steeple. I know a church in a community that it met in 6 different places in its history. It was the church that met once in the little Catholic chapel that had the confessional booth in it. And I said, I'm sure we were the only Baptist church, not just New England, but the country that had a confessional booth in it. But I said, I told our one lone deacon, you do a good job or else, we have an appointment in the morning at 11 o'clock. But
Meet
that
up at the
church,
confession box. Never was he
that's right,
willing to hear.
that's right. That church that went through 6 different locations, um, today is a lovely building, but in one of its mid facilities in the library, the high school had the most number that's ever had since. And that was back when they owned land, but no building on it.
Mhm.
And so buildings are just tools. They have to be brought to life through God's spirit and presence and worship. And, even this just comes to mind that even the smallest new beginning, a Bible study. Of course, many of our church plant started in the home, storefront, a small Bible study. But then even there, worship was important. And you can do the aspects of not just study can be dry at times, but make it a worshipful experience also.
You're where I want to kind of wind this up. We could, gosh, I could continue talking to you for a long time.
Well, you're
Um,
kind.
but in terms of legacy and finishing well, you're kind of answering how to finish well, and you're kind of answering leaving a legacy. What do you think? I read that passage right at the very beginning about King Solomon and contrasted with King David. And that's just such a sobering passage in 1 Kings 11. But what do you think would be, just some little bullet points, keys to finishing well?
Well, Solomon, took his eyes off of God and
Mm.
onto the worldly pleasures. And so, even in church planting, unless we keep focused on God, making prayer the foundational ministry and evangelism, of course, and reaching people, then there won't be a legacy. You don't. at the time you don't think, well, I'm doing this for legacy. I think that
Right.
would be too vain for anybody to ever think that. Maybe some do. Maybe some politicians probably are always got their legacy in mind. But you don't plan your legacy. But if you serve well and keep your focus on the main thing, on God, prayer, study, people, really, people always count more than buildings, structures, institutions, then the legacy will take care of itself. And I never thought about, having a legacy. And I still feel like that many days as I go back and relive some of those. I wish I had done this differently. Maybe it would have turned out different. I wish I had maybe that pastor that counted the cloudy days. Wish I had told him that just did God call you here? You came, you signed up for the 2-year program. If he called you, God doesn't mind the clouds, he's master of the clouds as well as the sunshine. So legacy, important. Um, Often I feel like I could have done so much more. I guess that's uh, not false humility, but that's just normal, I guess. There's always more that can be done, maybe could have been done, but you maybe at that particular time with the resources that you had, who you are, your own gifts and abilities, the community. Some communities are tougher and harder than others. Some just seem to just fall into place like picking grapes off the vine. Others, you do everything you can and still zero, zilch almost. But that's up to God. We leave that with Him as we make sure our call is alive and our not like Solomon. We've gone off onto that which is far lesser gods. Solomon had deities and gods, but not the one.
No.
And so I'm sure that the landscape today has some church planters who didn't make it and were disillusioned. I hope God uh, healed them of that. They got past that and they maybe went to successful ministries elsewhere. I think of those who stayed by the stuff. Bob over in Middlebury, Bob just passed away a few months ago. Stayed by the stuff all those years.
Yeah.
And by the way, we used to laugh and say, if people got tired of his sermons, the smell of the pizza from the pizza parlor down below was wafting up. So Bob, hurry up, cut it short so we can get to the pizza parlor. But Bob
Oh,
stayed by
quick
the
story.
stuff all those years. And so
Okay, lightning round, which really should be uh, perhaps a conversation about a second conversation. But what do you hope younger pastors in New England will carry forward in terms of what you've seen over these 40 years and now more years than that in terms of what God has done and is doing in New England? What do you hope they carry forward?
well, the basic, fundamental principles of church planting and growing churches, reaching people, evangelism, um, with all the wonderful modern techniques that we have today, mass communication, all of that, but use that for the same purpose of reaching people. We shouldn't ever let the tools become, the prime thing. And they're exciting, I'm sure, for those who are caught up in them and their lives are built around them. But you're much closer to the scene than I am. That could go to an extreme also. It would be detrimental to what they're called to do is to plant or grow a church or pastor a church. I realize today we're talking to not just church planters, but that was my main emphasis. But the principles really are the same.
Yeah.
Is- So, and consider how New England is changing. It's not the staid, uh, old historic New England that it once was. The remnants are there. The buildings, the structures, the libraries, the
Deep
historical
in the culture,
societies.
deep in the culture, it's there.
That's right. The Yankee magazine is still there after all these years. And Vermont life went by the wayside, but um that still, though, reaching the people. It would be different ways. And especially, I'm so excited for the student ministry, college ministry there. Uh, Look what's happened, how our country's been turned upside down in the last month by Eric's death. And we hear of revivals breaking out. I don't know if you've heard of any on New England campuses. I would hope so, but we hear about them here in the more of the Bible Belt, at Atlanta area, where you've got thousands and thousands of students, massive numbers of students coming together. So I would think that that's a great challenge of reaching, as we hear all the time. They come to the greater Boston area from all over the world, to study and then go back home. And nobody has to pay the mission salary for them. So if we reach them here, then they take the gospel back.
Well, if you're willing, I would love to extend this a little bit and have a second part to this. But
Uh-huh.
a couple of things that I didn't get to that one thing I know about you is that you pray regularly for New England, and so I guess in a next episode, I'd want to know a little bit more about why does your heart continue to beat so strongly for New England today after you've been gone for a lot of years? Second question. Where do you see hope for the church in New England? And then, if we could finish with this one, actually respond to this one. If you could speak to every pastor and church planter in New England right now, what encouragement would you give them?
That's a mouthful. And yet, I have, I can't explain the heartbeat. I just dearly, from day one, fell in love with New England. Now, that's sort of strange for a farm boy from Kentucky, but I just fell in love with New England. Its past, its present, its history, its potential, its beauty, um, its people. And though we never found the people, cold or reserved or didn't welcome us, with open hearts, they, I love the accent. I never tried to copy it. And I know a few people that tried, to become a New England by copying. That's disastrous. You can't do it, You know that. And but I maybe I lost some of my Kentucky accent. Somebody once said, and I felt that was a compliment. You just speak like you're from America. You just have an accent that would probably be at home most any place. So um, I would say, again, the accent on the student ministry, where God's gifted us in a way that we can never understand, but He placed in the hand today open doors for students. And as we reach students, they scatter throughout New England, around the world,
Yeah.
and they're an integral part of the churches. Don't overlook the churches. Use ear stoppers if you can't, if the music is too loud. And I clap on the off beats, and I saw this little cartoon as you enter the church foyer, where it says clapping side, non-clapping side. You can choose your side. I'd have to be the non-clapping side because I have no sense of rhythm. Linda's often said that. You're stone dead for terms of rhythm. But whatever the tools are, hope for New England, continued growth. I wish the Lord would let me hang around for the 500th congregation. We're what, four something? I don't know just where we are, 450 or something. And let me realize 500, and also to see the history continued, written. I think Dan Nicholas is the one to do that.
I
Um,
agree. We nominate him.
he's so gifted in terms of his ability to put on paper
Yeah.
what I struggled even putting it into words, especially on paper. And what was part three? My mind is playing a little trick on me here,
I
Robbie.
no, I think you've answered it well in
Um,
a short lightning round, but I would like to give further time to that in another episode. I'd like to hear more stories and personal experiences about
there's
people.
so many, and
Yeah.
today I would like to have included more, but there are so many that were just hanging out there, ready to be picked, and that was a part of the ministry, part of church planting. Some of them funny, some not so funny.
Hmm.
Some sort of didn't end well, but most of them did. And just to let New England realize that God's not done. And though New England as a whole maybe has become more secular, we've been there all these years and still it's progressively more secular. Well, that's true of the nation. The Bible Belt is certainly that way. What can be done to stem that? Just more people will sense the call. And if you have the call, like I said earlier, I would have hiked there uh, and all the way just to go. And I can't explain it, Robbie, and it's still there. That's why whenever Russ does his Zoom calls, I like to be a part of that.
I love
And
it.
I communicate with several pastors, pray for them. The Lord allows us a little funding sometime to help some out. And we love Terry and don't know the other staff members as well, but grateful that Sandy is still there and that you've joined the team and other wonderful people there. And again, I didn't stress enough a bullet here for using of volunteers. They're out there saying, we want to come. Tell us when and how and what we can do. I know sometimes it's work to have volunteers. Sometimes when you had them back to back to back, you wish the one group would cancel on you almost. That wasn't very spiritual, but your body said maybe they won't come. But poor Russ, I pray for him. Goodness gracious, trying to pastor Moscow and yet coordinate all the other churches. I'm so glad he's where he in that position.
I am
And
too.
and Terry, again, we like to say we invented Terry. I think I've told you that before, Linda and I. And I've got some funny stories about Terry along the way too.
Well,
And
I think there would be a big audience to hear some of those,
and
and that's, I mean, that's, and somewhat direct and indirect. You and Linda had a part in shaping some of the lives and modeling for and seeing develop some of the leaders in New England and that are still on the scene today.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you want to support our work in New England, you'll find a link in the description.